He walked out on his wife for his lover, completely unaware his wife was the hidden heir to a billion-dollar empire that owned the firm he worked for, blind to her massive fortune and the revenge she planned. But what she did crushed him and left him devastated in ways he never saw coming. For 3 years, she'd played the role of the struggling artist's wife, living in their modest apartment while he climbed the corporate ladder at Richardson Global Industries, but the truth was far more explosive than he could have imagined. She was Evelyn Richardson, sole heir to the empire her grandfather built, the very company that employed him as a mid-level manager, but she'd hidden her identity to find real love. He threw it all away for Amanda, his ambitious colleague, but he had no idea the woman he abandoned controlled his entire professional fate. The divorce papers were signed, but what came next would destroy everything he thought he'd gained. Would he survive the systematic dismantling of his new life? Could he comprehend the magnitude of what he'd lost? Would the revenge she planned leave him with anything at all? The rain hammered against the windows of the downtown apartment as Derek Mitchell stood in the living room, suitcase in hand, but his wife Emma sat motionless on the threadbare couch they'd bought at a thrift store 5 years ago. The apartment smelled of the cheap vanilla candles she loved, but he'd grown to hate that scent, associating it with everything he felt he'd outgrown. "I'm done, Emma," Derek said, his voice cold and rehearsed, but Emma's green eyes remained fixed on the half-finished painting on her easel. "I'm leaving you for Amanda. She understands my ambitions. She's going somewhere in life." Emma's brush hovered over the canvas, but she didn't turn around. Her auburn hair fell in waves down her back, but Derek no longer noticed the beauty that had once captivated him. He'd met her at a coffee shop 7 years ago when he was a struggling business school graduate and she was a dreamy art student. But now he was on the fast track at Richardson Global Industries and she was still painting in their cramped apartment. "Did you hear me?" Derek pressed, but Emma finally set down her brush. "I heard you," she said softly, but there was something in her tone he couldn't quite place. Not sadness, not anger, but something else entirely. "Amanda and I are moving into her condo in the city," Derek continued, but Emma stood up, wiping her hands on her paint-stained jeans. "We're going to build a real life together, not this poverty-level existence." Emma walked to the window, but she didn't look at the rain. Instead, she gazed at the skyline dominated by the Richardson Global Tower, the building where Derek spent 60 hours a week trying to impress executives he'd never met. "When did you stop loving me?" Emma asked, but Derek shifted uncomfortably. "It's not about love, Emma," he said, but the lie tasted bitter even as he spoke it. "It's about building a future. Amanda is a senior analyst. She has connections. She can help me get promoted to VP level. What do you have? Paint under your fingernails and dreams that don't pay bills." Emma turned to face him, but her expression was eerily calm. Her lips curved into the slightest smile, but Derek was too self-absorbed to notice the danger in it. "You're right," Emma said, but her voice carried an edge that made Derek pause. "I don't have much to offer someone as ambitious as you." "Exactly," Derek said, relieved she was making this easier, but he failed to see the calculated strategy behind her acquiescence. "I'll have my lawyer send over the divorce papers. You can keep the apartment and your paintings. I don't want anything from this marriage." "How generous," Emma murmured, but Derek was already heading for the door. He left without looking back, but if he had, he might have seen Emma pull out her phone and dial a number she hadn't called in 3 years. The voice that answered was crisp and professional, but warm with recognition. "Miss Richardson," the voice said, but Emma smiled at the familiar greeting. "It's been too long. Are you finally ready to come home?" 6 months earlier, Derek had been riding high on his success at Richardson Global Industries, but he had no idea that every promotion, every opportunity, every door that had opened for him had been carefully orchestrated by the woman who shared his bed. He'd started at the company 5 years ago as a junior analyst, but his rise had been meteoric. Within 2 years, he was managing a team, but by year 4, he was overseeing an entire division. His colleagues whispered about his luck, but Derek attributed it to his superior skills and work ethic. What Derek didn't know was that every performance review had crossed Emma's desk before reaching his superiors, but she'd never told him about the trust fund she'd never touched or the corporate empire she'd inherited on her 21st birthday. She'd wanted to live a normal life, to find love that wasn't tainted by her family's wealth. But Derek had proven that even without knowing about her money, people could still be bought, just with different currency. Amanda Clark had entered the picture 8 months ago, but she was everything Emma wasn't in Derek's increasingly materialistic eyes. Amanda drove a BMW, but Emma took the bus. Amanda wore designer suits, but Emma preferred vintage dresses from thrift stores. Amanda talked about quarterly earnings, but Emma talked about light and shadow and the human condition. Derek had started staying late at the office, but Emma had known about the affair for 6 months. She'd hired a private investigator the first night Derek came home smelling of Amanda's distinctive Chanel perfume, but instead of confronting him, she'd watched and waited. The investigator's reports had been thorough, but they'd revealed more than just an affair. Amanda had been calculating her move on Derek for months, researching his marriage, his finances, his prospects. But she'd made one critical error. She'd assumed Derek had married Emma for love, not knowing there was anything else to consider. Emma had read the texts between Derek and Amanda, but each one had hardened her resolve. Amanda had written about how Emma was dead weight and holding Derek back, but the messages that had truly sealed their fate were the ones where Amanda laughed about Emma's pathetic art career, and Derek had agreed, calling his wife delusional for thinking she could make it as a painter. But Emma's paintings hung in galleries across Europe under a pseudonym, selling for 6 figures each, and she'd donated millions to arts programs anonymously. She'd been playing a role, testing Derek, hoping he'd prove her wrong about people who married for money, but he'd failed spectacularly. The Richardson family had built their fortune in manufacturing during the post-war boom, but Emma's grandfather, Thomas Richardson, had diversified into technology, real estate, and finance in the 1980s. By the time Emma was born, Richardson Global Industries was a multinational conglomerate worth $8.7 billion, but her childhood had been anything but normal. Emma's parents had died in a plane crash when she was 16, but her grandfather had raised her in the family estate, a sprawling mansion in Connecticut. Thomas had been a formidable businessman, but he'd also been a loving grandfather who'd recognized Emma's artistic soul. "The money will always be there," Thomas had told her on her 18th birthday, but his weathered hand had gripped hers tightly. "But genuine human connection, that's the rarest treasure of all. Promise me you'll find someone who loves you for you, not for what I've built." Emma had promised, but her first serious relationship in college had ended when she'd discovered her boyfriend was secretly planning to propose, only after confirming her inheritance rumors with his father's lawyer. The betrayal had devastated her, but it had also taught her a valuable lesson. When Thomas died 3 years later, Emma had inherited everything, but the will had contained unusual provisions. She could access her full inheritance only after her 25th birthday, but until then, a board of trustees would manage the company. The provision had given her freedom, but it had also given her the opportunity to live anonymously. She'd moved to the city with a modest trust fund meant to cover basic expenses, but she'd enrolled in art school under her mother's maiden name, Emma Foster. She'd rented the cheap apartment, bought second-hand furniture, and lived the life of a struggling artist. But it had felt more real than anything in her privileged upbringing. When she'd met Derek at that coffee shop, he'd been charming and ambitious, but also kind and attentive, or so she'd thought. He'd been impressed by her art, not her money, but he'd held her when she cried about her grandfather on the anniversary of his death. He'd proposed with a $300 ring he'd saved for months to buy. But Emma had said yes because she'd believed she'd finally found what her grandfather wanted for her. Their wedding had been small and intimate, but Emma's trustees had attended under the guise of being distant relatives. Derek had never questioned it, too focused on his new job at Richardson Global, a position Emma had quietly arranged through intermediaries wanting to give her husband opportunities, but never suspecting it would become his obsession. For 3 years, Emma had watched Derek become someone she didn't recognize, but she'd held on to hope. She'd continued painting, continued living simply, continued being the supportive wife, but Derek had grown more distant with each promotion, each raise, each step up the corporate ladder that Emma had secretly paved for him. The affair with Amanda had been the final straw, but Emma had waited for Derek to make his choice. She'd given him every opportunity to recommit to their marriage, but when he'd walked out with his suitcase, he'd sealed his fate. 3 weeks after Derek moved in with Amanda, he arrived at work to find the entire executive floor in chaos, but nobody would tell him what was happening. His badge no longer granted him access to certain floors, but when he'd tried to ask his assistant about it, she'd looked at him with something like pity. "There's a meeting in the main conference room," she'd said, but her voice had been strained. "All senior staff, mandatory attendance." Derek had straightened his tie and headed to the conference room, but Amanda was already there, looking uncharacteristically nervous. They'd been careful about their relationship at work, but Derek had started planning how he'd navigate office politics once their relationship was public. "What's going on?" Derek whispered to Amanda, but she shook her head. "No idea," she said, but her hands were trembling slightly. "But I heard rumors that ownership was changing hands." The room fell silent as the doors opened, but the woman who walked in made Derek's heart stop. Emma stood at the head of the conference table, but she looked nothing like the woman he'd left. Her paint-stained jeans were gone, replaced by a tailored Armani suit, but her auburn hair was swept back in an elegant chignon. She wore minimal jewelry, but the diamond earrings Derek glimpsed were worth more than his annual salary. Behind Emma walked 3 men in expensive suits, but Derek recognized one of them from his wedding, the distant relative who'd given them a generous check as a wedding gift. "Good morning," Emma said, but her voice carried an authority Derek had never heard before. "For those who don't know me, my name is Evelyn Richardson. I am the sole heir and majority shareholder of Richardson Global Industries. As of today, I'm assuming active leadership of the company my grandfather built." The room erupted in whispers, but Derek felt like he was going to be sick. Evelyn Richardson? His mind raced back through every conversation, every moment, every lie by omission, but the pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity. "My grandfather believed in giving people opportunities to prove themselves," Emma continued, but her eyes swept the room, pointedly avoiding Derek. "For the past 5 years, I've been living under my mother's maiden name, observing this company from a unique vantage point. What I've seen has been illuminating." Amanda had gone pale beside Derek, but Emma wasn't finished. "This company was built on innovation and integrity," Emma said, but her voice hardened. "Unfortunately, some employees have forgotten those values. We'll be conducting comprehensive performance reviews, but I can already announce some immediate changes." Emma nodded to one of the men in suits, but he began distributing folders to specific people around the table. Derek received one, but so did Amanda. "Mr. Mitchell," Emma said, but she finally looked directly at Derek. "Your employment with Richardson Global Industries is terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building." Derek's hands shook as he opened the folder, but inside were printouts of every favoritism he'd shown to Amanda's projects, every corner he'd cut, every ethical violation he'd committed in his pursuit of advancement. The documentation was exhaustive, but it was also irrefutable. "This is insane," Derek said, but his voice came out as a croak. "You can't do this. I have contracts, rights. You also have a non-compete clause," And a morality clause, Emma said, but her expression remained neutral. Both of which you've violated. My legal team has been thorough, Mr. Mitchell. If you try to fight this, we'll countersue for damages in the amount of $3.2 million, the estimated cost of your mismanagement and ethical breaches. Derek looked at Amanda for support, but she was reading her own folder, her face ashen. Ms. Clark, Emma continued, but there was something almost sympathetic in her tone. Your situation is slightly different. You showed promise when you were hired, but you've allowed personal ambition to compromise your judgment. You're being transferred to our Des Moines office, effective in 2 weeks, but you'll be demoted to junior analyst. The choice is yours. Accept the transfer or resign. You can't humiliate us like this, Amanda said, but her voice lacked conviction. I'm not humiliating you, Emma replied, but her green eyes were cold. I'm holding you accountable. My grandfather always said that character is revealed not in success, but in how we treat people when we think there are no consequences. You both failed that test. Security guards appeared at the door, but Derek felt his world collapsing. He looked at Emma, Evelyn, and saw a stranger, but also glimpses of the woman he'd abandoned. The calm acceptance when he'd told her he was leaving hadn't been defeat, but calculation. You were my wife, Derek said, but the words sounded hollow, even to him. How can you do this? You were my husband, Emma replied, but her voice carried 3 years of disappointment. I gave you everything that mattered, my love, my trust, my loyalty, but it wasn't enough because you couldn't see value in anything that didn't come with a price tag. So now you get exactly what you wanted. A life measured purely in dollars and cents, and you'll find yours worth significantly less than you imagined. The news of Evelyn Richardson's return to Richardson Global spread through the business world like wildfire, but Derek became a cautionary tale. His termination was covered in industry publications, but the details of his ethical violations became public record when he'd foolishly tried to sue for wrongful termination. Emma's legal team had destroyed him in court, but they'd also revealed his affair with Amanda, his misuse of company resources, and his pattern of favoring projects based on personal relationships rather than merit. The case had been dismissed with prejudice, but Derek had been ordered to pay Richardson Global's legal fees, a sum that had immediately bankrupted him. Amanda had taken the transfer to Des Moines, but she'd left Derek behind without a second thought. Their relationship, built on mutual ambition and convenience, had crumbled the moment the power dynamic shifted, but Derek couldn't even be angry because he recognized the same calculation he'd used when abandoning Emma. Within 2 months, Derek had lost everything, but the systematic precision of his downfall revealed Emma's careful planning. The condo Amanda had owned was actually owned by a Richardson Global subsidiary, but the lease had been terminated when she'd transferred. Derek had been living there rent-free without knowing it, but now he was being evicted. His car, a luxury sedan he'd leased, had been repossessed when he couldn't make payments, but his bank accounts had been frozen due to the legal judgment. Every credit card had been maxed out on legal fees, but his credit score had plummeted, making it impossible to rent even a modest apartment. Derek had tried to find work at other firms, but Richardson Global's reach was extensive. A quiet word from Emma's office ensured that no major corporation would touch him, but the non-compete clause prevented him from working in his field for 3 years. He'd built his identity around his career, but now he had nothing. He'd moved into a motel on the outskirts of the city, but the irony wasn't lost on him. It was cheaper than the apartment he'd shared with Emma, yet it felt like a prison. His phone, once constantly buzzing with work calls and messages, sat silent, but the few contacts who did reach out were former colleagues calling to gloat or journalists wanting quotes for articles about corporate ethics. One night, Derek found himself outside the building where Emma still kept the apartment, but the lights were off. He'd learned from social media that she'd moved back to the family estate in Connecticut, but she'd kept the apartment, turning it into a studio for underprivileged art students. His former home was now a scholarship program in Thomas Richardson's name, but every young artist who used the space was someone Emma was helping in ways she'd never been able to help Derek. 6 months after his termination, Derek sat in a support group for people who'd lost everything in corporate downsizings, but he couldn't bring himself to speak. The others talked about layoffs, about bad luck, about circumstances beyond their control. But Derek knew his situation was entirely his own doing. He'd taken a job as a night manager at a convenience store, but the pay barely covered his motel rent. His co-workers were kind, but they had no idea that 6 months ago he'd been overseeing multi-million-dollar accounts. He wore a name tag that said Derek in all caps, but he felt like an imposter in his own life. One evening, a woman came into the store carrying an art supply bag, but Derek's breath caught when he recognized one of Emma's paintings on her phone case. The woman was young, maybe 20, but her eyes held the same dreamy quality Emma's once had. "Excuse me," Derek found himself saying, but the woman looked up from browsing. "That painting on your phone case, where did you get it?" The woman's face lit up, but her enthusiasm was infectious. "Oh, you recognize it? It's by E.F. Winters. She's my absolute favorite artist, but her work is so expensive I could never afford an original. This is just a print, but I love it anyway." "E.F. Winters?" Derek repeated, but the initials clicked. Emma Foster, her mother's maiden name, but with Winters likely a play on Richardson, the season her grandfather had loved most. "She's incredible," the woman continued, but she pulled out her phone to show him more images. "She does these pieces about hidden truths and masked identities. There's this one called The Emperor's New Fortune that just sold for $400,000, but critics say it's her most personal work yet." Derek looked at the painting on the screen, but his heart sank. The piece showed a man in an expensive suit, standing alone in an empty room, but in the reflection of a window you could see his true self. Naked, small, grasping at shadows. Behind him a woman's silhouette walked away, but she was illuminated by golden light that the man couldn't see. "She's been funding art scholarships for years," the woman added, but her voice grew passionate. "She just opened a studio program in the city that gives free space to artists who can't afford rent. I'm actually heading there now for a class. She doesn't teach personally, but the instructors she hired are amazing." After the woman left, Derek had looked up E.F. Winters online, but the rabbit hole had been devastating. Emma's work had been critically acclaimed for years, but she deliberately kept her identity secret. Articles gushed about her authentic voice and her commitment to artistic integrity over commercial success, but several interviews quoted her saying she'd learned about pretense and performance from personal experience. One interview stood out, but it had been published just last week. "My grandfather taught me that real wealth isn't in what you have, but in who you are when no one is watching," Emma had said, but the interviewer had pressed about rumors of her true identity. "I lived a simple life for years because I wanted to understand what people valued. I learned that some people can't see treasure even when they're holding it. They're so focused on the reflection of gold that they miss the real thing right in front of them. That's the saddest kind of poverty, not of money, but of perception." 1 year after the divorce was finalized, Derek received an unexpected letter, but the return address was the Richardson estate in Connecticut. His hands shook as he opened it, but inside was an invitation to an art exhibition opening. Emma's first public show under her real name, Evelyn Richardson. "You're invited to witness what you could never see," the inscription read, but there was no malice in the words, only a simple statement of fact. Derek knew he shouldn't go, but something compelled him to take the bus to the gallery in Manhattan. The opening was crowded with art collectors, critics, and socialites, but Derek felt invisible in his thrift store suit. He'd lost 40 pounds from stress, but his hair had started graying at the temples. Emma's paintings covered the walls, but each one told a story of hidden identity, masked truth, and the cost of superficiality. There was a series called The Invisible Fortune that showed the same woman in different scenarios, shopping at thrift stores while wearing priceless jewelry underneath her clothes, but no one noticed. Riding the bus while corporate towers bearing her name loomed in the background, painting alone while her work sold for millions under pseudonyms. The centerpiece of the exhibition was massive, but it made Derek stop breathing. Called The Man Who Couldn't See, it showed a couple in their modest apartment, but the woman was surrounded by subtle golden light that the man couldn't perceive. In the background, visible only if you looked carefully, were shadows of wealth, a corporate logo, a family crest, a crown, but the man's eyes were fixed on a distant horizon, reaching for something he thought was better. "It's autobiographical, isn't it?" a critic near Derek was saying, but her companion nodded. Richardson lived in poverty for years while being worth billions. The subject is clearly her ex-husband. I heard he left her for someone he thought was more successful, but he had no idea his wife literally owned the company he worked for. The revenge was masterful, the companion replied, but Derek felt sick. She didn't just fire him, she systematically dismantled his entire self-concept. He thought he was special, chosen, talented, but she'd been the one orchestrating his success all along. When she pulled back that curtain, he discovered he was just average and couldn't handle it. Derek wanted to leave, but Emma appeared at the center of the gallery. She wore a simple black dress, but she radiated confidence and grace. Her auburn hair fell in natural waves, but she looked healthier and happier than he'd ever seen her. "Thank you all for coming," Emma said, but the room fell silent. "These paintings are about the masks we wear and the truths we hide, sometimes from others, but more often from ourselves. We live in a world that confuses price with value, but they're not the same thing. The most valuable things in life, love, integrity, authenticity, can't be bought or sold. They can only be given freely or lost forever." Her eyes swept the room, but they landed on Derek. For a moment their gazes held, but Emma's expression was unreadable. She didn't look angry or triumphant, but there was a sadness in her eyes that cut deeper than any revenge. "I painted these to process my own journey," Emma continued, but she looked away from Derek. "I thought hiding my identity would help me find genuine connection, but I learned that people reveal themselves not through what they say they value, but through what they do when they think there are no consequences. That's the measure of character, but it's also the source of my greatest disappointment and my greatest freedom." After the exhibition, Derek had walked the streets of Manhattan for hours, but his mind was reeling. Every assumption he'd built his life on had been false, but the cruelest part was realizing that Emma had given him everything he'd claimed to want: opportunities, connections, advancement, and he'd thrown it away because it hadn't come with a recognizable price tag. He'd thought he was trading up when he left Emma for Amanda, but he'd actually been trading everything for nothing. Amanda had wanted him for his prospects, but those prospects had been built entirely on Emma's hidden influence. Without her, he was just another mediocre middle manager, but his ego had convinced him he was special. The systematic way Emma had dismantled his life wasn't really revenge, but it was something more devastating. She'd simply removed her support and let him experience his true value in the market. Every door that had opened easily before now required actual merit to enter, but Derek didn't have enough of it. The Emperor really had been wearing nothing all along, but Emma had been the only one kind enough to pretend otherwise. Derek had started keeping a journal, but the entries were painful exercises in self-reflection. "I thought I was ambitious, but I was just greedy. I thought I was pragmatic, but I was just cruel. I thought I was choosing success, but I was choosing emptiness. Emma gave me love, and I treated it like it was worthless. She gave me opportunity, and I used it to betray her. She gave me partnership, and I abandoned her the moment I thought I could do better. But there was no better. There was only her, and I was too blind to see it. His mother had called one evening, but the conversation had been devastating in its honesty. "Your father and I tried to raise you better than this," she'd said, but her disappointment was palpable. "That girl loved you, Derek, but you treated her like she was beneath you. Now you've learned she was never beneath you. You were beneath her, and she'd been kind enough not to make you feel it. That's what real class looks like, but you were too busy chasing status to recognize it." The motel room had become Derek's monastery, but his penance was facing himself in the mirror each morning. He'd aged 10 years in one, but it wasn't just the physical toll. His eyes looked hollow, but they saw clearly for the first time in years. He'd started volunteering at a homeless shelter on his days off, but the work was humbling. The people he served had lost everything through circumstances often beyond their control: medical bankruptcy, mental illness, systemic injustice. But Derek had destroyed himself through pure selfishness. They were generous with what little they had, but he'd been greedy with everything he'd been given. 18 months after his termination, Derek received another letter from Emma, but this time it contained something unexpected: divorce papers with a settlement agreement. Emma was offering him $50,000, but the letter explained her reasoning. "Derek, I'm not sending you this money because you deserve it, but I'm sending it because I made a vow to love and support you, and I don't break my vows even when others break theirs. This is enough to pay off your legal debts and give you a fresh start, but what you do with it is entirely up to you. I hope you've learned that money is just a tool. It can't buy character, integrity, or love, but it can buy time to develop those things if you choose to use it wisely. I forgave you the moment you walked out, not because what you did was acceptable, but because holding on to anger would only poison me. You'll have to live with your choices, but I won't let them define me. I've moved on, and I hope someday you can too. This is goodbye, Derek, but I genuinely wish you well." Derek had cried reading the letter, but they were tears of shame rather than relief. Emma had offered him mercy when he'd deserved nothing but contempt, but the generosity only highlighted how poorly he'd treated her. He'd used half the money to pay off his debts, but the other half he'd donated to Emma's art scholarship program. He'd written a letter explaining that he wanted to support the kind of person he'd failed to be, but he hadn't expected a response. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived, but this time it was brief. "Your donation has been matched by the Richardson Foundation. These scholarships will now bear both our names, not because you've earned it, but because I believe in the possibility of redemption. The Derek I married was capable of kindness and growth, but somewhere along the way, you lost yourself. I hope you find him again. E." 3 years after walking out on his wife, Derek stood in a small community center in Brooklyn, but he was teaching a financial literacy class to low-income workers. He'd completed his business degree through online classes while working at the convenience store, but he'd specialized in nonprofit management rather than corporate advancement. He lived in a modest studio apartment, but the space was clean and organized. On his wall hung a print of one of Emma's paintings, not the devastating one from her exhibition, but an earlier piece showing hands building something together, though only one figure was visible in the frame. He'd bought it at a fundraiser, but the irony wasn't lost on him that he was now spending his money on the art he'd once dismissed. His phone rang, but the number was unknown. Derek answered cautiously, but the voice on the other end made his heart skip. "Derek, it's Emma," she said, but there was warmth in her tone rather than the cold authority from their last corporate encounter. "I hope I'm not overstepping by calling. I wanted to tell you that I've been following your work with the community center, but I'm impressed by what you're doing." "Emma?" Derek breathed, but he sat down heavily. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Emma replied, but he could hear her smile. "I called because the Richardson Foundation is expanding our financial education programs, but we're looking for someone to direct the initiative. Your name came up and I wanted to reach out personally. I'm not sure I'm qualified, Derek said honestly, but he felt a flicker of hope. And given our history is exactly why you're qualified, Emma interrupted gently. You've lived through the consequences of poor values and choices, but you've spent 3 years rebuilding yourself from the ground up. That perspective is invaluable, but more importantly, you're doing the work because you believe in it, not because you're chasing status. That's the person I hoped you could become. They talked for an hour, but the conversation was different from any they'd had during their marriage. Derek was honest about his struggles, his regrets, his gradual understanding of how profoundly he'd failed, but Emma listened without judgment. I loved you, Derek, Emma said eventually, but her voice was soft. I still care about you, though not in the same way. What hurt most wasn't that you left, but that you couldn't see me, really see me. I was invisible to you unless I fit your idea of what was valuable. But that's not love. That's projection. I know, Derek said, but his throat was tight. I was so focused on climbing that I forgot to appreciate where I was. You gave me everything, but I was too arrogant to recognize it. I destroyed the best thing in my life because I thought success was somewhere else, with someone else. But success was holding my hand all along. We both made mistakes, Emma said, but Derek could hear her taking a breath. I shouldn't have hidden who I was. I should have trusted you with the truth, but I was so afraid of being valued for the wrong reasons that I created a test you couldn't pass. That wasn't fair to you. You gave me every chance to prove myself, Derek countered, but he meant it. I failed because of who I was, not because of anything you did or didn't tell me. The truth is, Emma, even if I'd known about your wealth, I'm not sure I would have treated you better. I might have stayed for the money, but I wouldn't have truly valued you. That's what devastates me most. Not what I lost, but how little I appreciated what I had. 6 months later, Derek walked into Richardson Global Headquarters for the first time since his termination. But this time he was a guest rather than an employee. Emma had invited him to the launch of the Richardson Foundation's financial literacy program, but the event was being held in the same conference room where she'd revealed her identity. The room was filled with community leaders, nonprofit directors, and the first cohort of program participants, but Derek felt both proud and humbled to be part of it. He'd accepted the director position, but he'd insisted on starting at a modest salary and earning any increases through demonstrated impact. Emma stood at the front of the room, but she was flanked by the board members who'd once attended their wedding as distant relatives. She wore a navy suit that was professional but not ostentatious, but her auburn hair was styled simply. She'd matured in the 3 years since their divorce, but the biggest change was in her eyes. They no longer held the guarded caution he remembered, but radiated confidence and purpose. This program exists because I believe everyone deserves access to the tools that build wealth, not just money, but the knowledge and skills that create lasting security, Emma said, but she looked directly at Derek. My director has a unique perspective on this work. He understands both the opportunities and the pitfalls of financial ambition, but more importantly, he's committed to helping others avoid the mistakes he made. That kind of honesty and humility is rare, but it's also what makes this program authentic. After the formal presentation, Emma and Derek found themselves alone on the balcony overlooking the city, but the awkwardness between them had faded into something more comfortable. I never apologized properly, Derek said, but he looked at the skyline rather than at Emma. Not just for leaving, but for all the ways I failed you during our marriage. I was so obsessed with becoming someone important that I never appreciated being with someone extraordinary. You were always more than I deserved, but I was too shallow to see it. You weren't shallow, Emma said, but she stood beside him at the railing. You were human. We all want validation and recognition, but you let that hunger consume you. The tragedy wasn't that you wanted success, it's that you couldn't recognize you'd already achieved it. I had a wife who loved me, a job I was good at, a simple but happy life, Derek said, but his voice cracked. That should have been enough, but I kept looking for more. I traded everything for nothing, and the worst part is I hurt you in the process. You didn't deserve that. No, I didn't, Emma agreed, but there was no bitterness in her tone. But I've made peace with it. You gave me clarity about what I needed, even if it wasn't what I wanted at the time. I needed to stop hiding and step into my full self, but I also needed to learn that money isn't the problem. It's what people do when they have it or want it. They stood in silence for a moment, but the city lights twinkled below them like a constellation of possibilities. Are you happy now? Derek asked, but Emma smiled. I am, she said, but her voice was genuine. I'm building something meaningful, supporting artists and communities, making the kind of impact my grandfather dreamed of. I'm dating someone, another artist who knew me as Emma Foster, before learning I was Evelyn Richardson, but we're taking it slowly. What about you? I'm not happy yet, Derek admitted, but he felt lighter saying it aloud. But I'm working toward it. I'm learning what actually matters, but more importantly, I'm learning to value things that can't be priced. That's a lesson I'm grateful to have learned, even if it cost me everything. Emma turned to face him, but her green eyes held compassion rather than the cold authority he'd seen in this building years ago. It didn't cost you everything, Derek, she said, but she touched his arm briefly. It cost you what you thought was everything, but those things were just illusions. You still have your life, your potential, your ability to grow and change. That's more than many people get after making the kinds of mistakes you made. Don't waste it. 5 years after the divorce, Derek stood in the community center that had become his second home, but the walls were covered with photos of program graduates. The Richardson Foundation's financial literacy initiative had served over 10,000 participants, but the success stories were mounting. Small business owners, first-time homebuyers, families breaking cycles of poverty. Derek's own apartment was still modest, but he'd furnished it carefully with meaningful pieces rather than impressive ones. On his bookshelf sat a worn copy of a financial ethics textbook he'd written, but the dedication read, "To E.R., who taught me that wealth without wisdom is worthless, but wisdom without humility is empty." He'd never remarried, but he dated occasionally. The relationships were different from his marriage to Emma, or his affair with Amanda. They were built on genuine connection rather than ambition or convenience, but Derek remained cautious about his own motives, always questioning whether he was truly seeing the person or just what he wanted to see. Emma's career had flourished, but she'd become known as both a brilliant artist and a philanthropic leader. She'd married her artist boyfriend 2 years ago, but the wedding had been covered in society pages as a celebration of love rather than merger of fortunes. Derek had sent a gift, a painting he'd commissioned from one of Emma's scholarship recipients, showing 2 people looking at the same sunset, but seeing entirely different colors, a meditation on perspective and perception. Emma had called to thank him, but the conversation had been easy and warm. They weren't friends exactly, but they'd achieved something perhaps more valuable, mutual respect and genuine goodwill. "I saw your interview in the Times," Emma had said, but Derek had cringed remembering his admission in the article about his failed marriage. "You were honest about what you did. That takes courage." "It's not courage," Derek had replied, but he'd meant it. "It's accountability. If my mistakes can help someone else avoid the same path, then maybe they weren't entirely wasted, though I'd give anything to have made different choices." "We all would," Emma had said gently, but there was wisdom in her tone. "But we can't unmake the past. We can only build a better future. You're doing that, Derek, but I want you to know I'm proud of who you've become." Those words had meant more to Derek than any promotion, any title, any recognition he'd ever received. But they'd also crystallized his understanding of what he'd lost. Emma's pride in his growth was valuable precisely because he'd forfeited her love through his failures, but the fact that she could still offer respect and encouragement showed the depth of character he'd been too blind to appreciate when they were married. The final twist in Derek's story came 7 years after the divorce, but it was both ironic and fitting. He'd been invited to speak at Richardson Global's annual leadership conference, but the topic was ethical decision-making in corporate environments. As he stood in the same conference room where Emma had revealed her identity and fired him, Derek understood the full circle his life had traced. "I'm going to tell you about the biggest mistake of my life," Derek began, but the room was silent. "I'm going to tell you about a man who had everything but couldn't see it, who destroyed his life through arrogance and greed, who learned the hardest possible way that success means nothing without character. That man was me, but the story I'm sharing isn't really about my failure. It's about the grace and wisdom of the woman who gave me opportunities I didn't deserve, held me accountable when I failed, but still believed I could become someone better. This is a story about Evelyn Richardson, but more importantly, it's a story about the values her grandfather built this company on, values I violated and had to learn to embody through loss and reconstruction." At the back of the room, Emma sat with her husband, but she was wiping her eyes. She'd insisted Derek tell his story unfiltered, trusting him to be honest about his failures and her response. But the vulnerability required to publicly admit such profound mistakes was itself a measure of how far he'd come. After the presentation, several young executives approached Derek, but their questions revealed they were struggling with similar temptations: the pull of ambition over ethics, the pressure to compromise values for advancement, the seductive belief that success was always somewhere else, with someone else. "How do you know if you're making the right choice?" one woman asked, but her eyes were troubled. "You ask yourself what you'll think about this decision in 5 years, Derek replied. But he'd learned this lesson through bitter experience. Will you be proud of how you treated people? Will you be able to look at yourself in the mirror? Will your success be built on a foundation of integrity or on the wreckage of your own character? Because the latter might work for a while, but eventually it all comes crashing down, and you'll discover you've lost things you can never get back." Emma approached him after the last attendee had left, but her smile was genuine and warm. "Thank you for doing this," she said, but she took his hand briefly. "I know it wasn't easy." "It was necessary," Derek replied, but he squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. "If I can save even one person from making my mistakes, from destroying something precious because they're chasing something shiny, then maybe my failure serves a purpose. That's all I can hope for now." "You're serving that purpose every day," Emma said, but her husband joined them, extending his hand to Derek. "I've heard a lot about you," he said, but his tone was respectful rather than territorial. "Emma speaks highly of the work you're doing. It takes a strong person to turn failure into purpose." "I had a good teacher," Derek said, but he looked at Emma with gratitude rather than longing. "She taught me that the measure of wealth isn't what you have, but what you do with it. And that applies to opportunities and second chances, too. I'm trying to use mine wisely." As Derek left Richardson Global that evening, he paused to look up at the tower bearing Emma's family name, but he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: peace. He'd never recover what he'd lost, but he'd built something new from the ruins of his old life. He'd never be the corporate executive he'd once aspired to become, but he'd become something perhaps more valuable: a person of integrity, purpose, and hard-won wisdom. Derek Mitchell and Evelyn Richardson became a case study in business schools, but it was taught not as a tale of revenge, but as an examination of values, consequences, and redemption. Students debated whether Emma's actions were justified or excessive, but the real lesson transcended those arguments. It was about the invisible architecture of relationships, the foundations we build our lives on, and the devastating cost of failing to appreciate treasure until it's gone. Emma's painting, The Man Who Couldn't See, was eventually purchased by a museum, but it hung in a gallery dedicated to works exploring themes of perception and value. The placard beside it read, "The artist's first husband served as inspiration for this piece." In interviews, Richardson has said, "We see what we're prepared to value. The tragedy isn't that we fail to recognize treasure. It's that we convince ourselves it isn't treasure until it's lost." Derek visited that museum once, but standing before the painting that immortalized his greatest failure, he felt no shame, only understanding. The man in the painting was who he'd been, but the man viewing it was who he'd become. The journey between those two people had been devastating, crushing, and humbling, but it had also been necessary, because Derek Mitchell had been unaware his wife was the hidden heir to a billion-dollar empire that owned the firm he worked for. But he'd left her for his lover, unaware of her massive fortune and the revenge she planned. What she did had crushed him and left him devastated, but it had also freed him from the prison of his own shallow values. The cost had been everything he thought he wanted, but the gain had been something infinitely more valuable, the chance to become someone worthy of the love he'd thrown away. And in that painful trade, Derek finally understood what Emma had known all along. The greatest fortune isn't counted in dollars, but in the richness of character, the depth of integrity, and the wisdom to recognize that some things, love, respect, authentic connection, are priceless precisely because they can't be bought, but only earned through who we choose to become when no one is watching but ourselves. 10 years later, the spring sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the Richardson Foundation headquarters, but Derek Mitchell stood in his corner office, reviewing scholarship applications from students whose stories reminded him of his own journey. Not the privilege he'd once chased, but the humility he'd been forced to learn. His title was Chief Impact Officer now, but the promotion had come after years of demonstrated results rather than political maneuvering. The gray at his temples had spread, but his eyes carried a clarity that had been absent in his younger years. On his desk sat a framed photo of him with a group of program graduates, their faces beaming with the kind of genuine success that couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet. The intercom buzzed, but his assistant's voice carried an unusual note of excitement. "Mr. Mitchell, you have a visitor," she said, but she paused. Well, you should probably just come to the lobby." Derek walked to the elevator with curiosity, but nothing could have prepared him for the scene in the marble-floored entrance. A teenage girl stood near the reception desk, but her auburn hair and green eyes were achingly familiar. Beside her stood Emma, but she looked different, softer, her hand resting protectively on the girl's shoulder. "Derek," Emma said, but her smile was warm and slightly nervous. "I'd like you to meet someone. This is Lily. She's 14 and, well, she's been asking about you." Derek's mind raced, but the timeline didn't make sense. He'd been divorced from Emma for 10 years, but this girl was... "I'm adopted," Lily said, but her voice was confident and direct, so much like Emma's. "Mom and Dad adopted me 6 years ago from foster care, but they've told me about their lives, including the people who shaped them. You're one of those people." Derek looked at Emma with confusion, but she gestured to a quiet seating area, away from the reception desk. They sat down, but Lily perched on the edge of her chair with the restless energy of a teenager on a mission. "Mom's told me your story," Lily continued, but she pulled out a worn notebook. "About how you were married, how you made terrible choices, how you lost everything and had to rebuild yourself. I'm doing a school project on redemption and second chances, but I wanted to meet you in person." "Lily," Emma said gently, but there was pride in her tone. "Wanted to interview you for her project, but she also has something else to tell you." Lily took a deep breath, but her hands gripped the notebook tightly. I was in the foster system for 8 years before Mom and Dad adopted me, but I went through 12 different homes. Most people gave up on me because I had behavioral problems, anger issues, trust issues, all kinds of issues. I was convinced I was worthless, that I'd ruined my chance at having a real family. Derek felt his throat tighten, but he stayed silent, sensing the importance of this moment. Then Mom and Dad found me, Lily continued, but her voice wavered slightly. Mom saw something in me that nobody else did, but she also told me about you. She said you'd made huge mistakes, hurt people, lost everything, but you'd chosen to rebuild yourself into someone better. She said if you could transform your life, then so could I. You were my inspiration, Lily said, but now tears were streaming down her face. Mom showed me articles about your work, about the programs you've built, about the people you've helped. She said the measure of a person isn't their worst moment, but what they do after it. When I was struggling in therapy, when I was convinced I was broken beyond repair, she'd tell me about Derek Mitchell, who'd had to face the consequences of destroying his own life, but chose to use that pain to help others. Derek felt his own eyes burning, but he looked at Emma with wonder. She'd used his story, his failures and painful reconstruction to help save this girl, but the generosity of that gesture was almost overwhelming. For the past 6 years, Emma said quietly, but she put her arm around Lily. Whenever Lily struggled with feeling unworthy or irredeemable, I'd remind her of you. I'd tell her that you were proof that people can change, that mistakes don't have to define us, that even our worst failures can become sources of purpose if we're brave enough to face them honestly. So I'm here to say thank you, Lily said, but she stood up and extended her hand formally. Thank you for being human enough to fail but strong enough to rebuild. Thank you for being honest about your mistakes so that people like me can believe we're not beyond hope. And thank you for showing me that redemption is real. Derek shook her hand, but he couldn't speak for a moment. When he finally found his voice, it was thick with emotion. Lily, I think you have that backwards, he said, but he gently pulled her into a hug. You're the one who's brave. You survived things that would have broken most people, but you kept fighting. I just had to face the consequences of my own choices. You had to overcome circumstances you never deserved. If my story helped you even a little bit, then maybe everything I went through had meaning I couldn't see. Emma stood and joined them, but the three of them formed a small circle in the lobby. Several employees had paused to watch, but they smiled at the obviously emotional reunion. There's something else, Emma said, but she looked at Derek with an expression he couldn't quite read. The Richardson Foundation is launching a new initiative for foster youth, comprehensive support including mentorship, education funding, life skills training, and long-term advocacy. We'd like you to co-direct it with our foster care specialist. But that's not all, Lily interjected, but her earlier nervousness had transformed into excitement. Mom's donating $10 million to start the program, but she's matching it with $10 million from you. Derek's eyes widened, but Emma laughed at his expression. Not from your pocket, Emma clarified, but her eyes sparkled with mischief. From your legacy. I've been tracking the social return on investment from your programs over the past decade, but the economic value you've generated through changed lives, increased earnings, decreased social costs, it's extraordinary. I calculated that your work has created over $10 million in measurable value, so the foundation is recognizing that contribution with a matching grant in your name. The Lily Mitchell Initiative for Foster Youth Success, Lily announced proudly, but she grinned at Derek's stunned expression. We're naming it after both of us, the girl who survived the system and the man who survived himself. Together we're proof that broken things can be made beautiful again. 3 months later, the launch event for the Lily Mitchell Initiative was held not in a corporate ballroom but in a renovated community center in the neighborhood where Derek had first started teaching financial literacy. But the crowd was a mix of foster youth, social workers, foundation staff, and community leaders. Derek stood at the podium, but Lily sat in the front row between Emma and her adoptive father, a kind-faced artist named James whose work explored themes of found family and chosen connections. The audience was diverse and engaged, but Derek felt a completeness he'd never experienced even during his corporate climbing days. 10 years ago, I stood in a different conference room and had my entire life dismantled, Derek began, but his voice was steady. I deserved it. I'd betrayed someone I loved, violated my professional ethics, and built my success on a foundation of selfishness and manipulation. When it all came crashing down, I thought my life was over. He paused, but he looked directly at Emma. She smiled encouragement, but her hand was clasped with James's, the two of them a picture of the genuine partnership Derek had once had and destroyed. What I didn't understand then was that my old life needed to end, Derek continued, but now he looked at Lily. Because that old life was built on false values, the belief that worth could be measured in titles and salaries, that people were valuable only if they could advance my ambitions, that success meant climbing over others rather than lifting them up. I had to lose everything to learn what actually mattered. This initiative exists because two people believed in transformation, Derek said, but his voice grew stronger. Emma Richardson believed in it when she used my story to help a hurting teenager see that change was possible. Lily believed in it when she decided that her past didn't have to define her future. And in believing in transformation, they gave me something I didn't deserve, but desperately needed. Proof that my failures could serve a purpose beyond my own punishment. Lily wiped her eyes, but she was smiling through her tears. Several other foster youth in the audience were leaning forward, but their expressions showed recognition. They saw themselves in this story. To every young person here who's been told you're too damaged, too difficult, too broken to deserve love and opportunity, Derek said. But he spoke directly to them now. I want you to know that's a lie. The truth is that we're all broken in different ways, but brokenness isn't the same as worthlessness. Some of us break ourselves through our own choices, like I did, but many of you were broken by circumstances beyond your control. Either way, you deserve the chance to rebuild into something beautiful. This program is our promise to you, Derek concluded, but he felt Emma's presence even across the room, her influence woven through every word. We promise to see your potential even when you can't see it yourself. We promise to support your growth even when it's messy and non-linear. We promise to believe in your capacity for transformation even when you've given up on yourself. Because if Derek Mitchell can go from selfish, arrogant corporate climber to someone whose life creates genuine value, then anyone can change. And if Lily Mitchell can go from a foster child the system had written off to a thriving young woman with purpose and hope, then the circumstances that shaped you don't have to limit you. The applause was thunderous, but Derek stepped away from the podium as Lily approached to share her own story. As she spoke about her journey from foster care to finding her family, about the darkness she'd survived and the light she'd discovered, Derek found himself standing next to Emma at the side of the room. Thank you, Derek said quietly, but the words carried 10 years of gratitude. For using my story to help her, for turning my worst mistakes into something redemptive, for believing I could become someone worth believing in. You did that yourself, Emma replied, but she touched his arm gently. I just held up a mirror so Lily could see what was possible. The transformation was yours, Derek, but I'm grateful it could serve a purpose beyond just your own healing. Do you ever regret it? Derek asked, but he immediately clarified. Not the divorce or the accountability, I deserved all of that. But do you regret marrying me in the first place? Those 3 years we were together? Emma was quiet for a moment, but her gaze was thoughtful rather than pained. I used to, she admitted, but her voice was soft. For a long time, I thought those years were wasted, that I'd been foolish to hide my identity and naive to think I could find uncomplicated love. But then I adopted Lily, and I realized that marriage, even a failed one, taught me essential things. It taught me about resilience, about the importance of seeing people clearly, about the difference between loving someone and enabling them. Those lessons made me a better mother, a better leader, a better partner to James. She paused, but she looked at Lily, who was describing her transformation to the rapt audience. And if my worst experience could become someone else's source of hope, Emma continued, but now she smiled at Derek. Then maybe it wasn't wasted after all. Maybe we both needed to walk through that particular fire. You to burn away your false self, me to forge my true one, so that we could eventually help people like Lily find their own paths through darkness. 5 years after the initiative launch. The documentary was titled The Price of Everything, The Value of Nothing, but it had won awards at festivals around the world. The filmmaker had spent 2 years following Derek, Emma, Lily, and a dozen program participants, but the result was a powerful meditation on worth, transformation, and the hidden costs of shallow values. Derek sat in a movie theater in Manhattan for the premiere, but he was surrounded by people whose lives had become intertwined with his. Emma and James, Lily, now 19 and studying social work, Amanda, who'd returned from Des Moines 5 years ago and now worked in nonprofit consulting, her own transformation complete, and dozens of program graduates. The film opened with footage from Derek's fateful speech in the Richardson Global Conference Room 10 years ago, but the camera captured Emma's expression as she'd fired him, not triumphant or cruel, but sad and resolute. The documentary interwove 3 parallel stories: Derek's fall and reconstruction, Lily's journey from foster care to purpose, and Emma's navigation of wealth, identity, and meaning. But the most powerful sequence came near the end, when the filmmaker had interviewed all 3 main subjects separately, but asked them the same question: what is the measure of a life well lived? Emma's answer was characteristically thoughtful. A life well lived is measured by how many people are better off because you existed, but also by whether you stayed true to your values when it would have been easier to compromise them. My grandfather taught me that wealth is a responsibility, not an achievement, but I had to learn that lesson myself by watching someone I loved choose material success over human connection. Now I try to use my resources to expand opportunities for others, while never forgetting that money can't buy the things that actually make life meaningful. Love, integrity, purpose, genuine connection. Lily's answer was raw and honest. I used to think a life well lived meant avoiding pain and accumulating security, but foster care taught me that pain is inevitable and security is fragile. Now I think it's about transformation, taking the broken pieces of our experiences and creating something beautiful with them. My mom and Derek showed me that we're not defined by our worst moments, but by what we do after them. A life well lived is one where you keep choosing growth even when staying broken would be easier. But it was Derek's answer that made the entire theater fall silent. For most of my life, I measured success by external markers: titles, salary, status, the approval of people I didn't even respect, but I thought those things would make me valuable. I was wrong. The measure of a life well lived is simpler and harder than I ever imagined. Did you see the people around you? Did you value what was valuable and love what was lovable? Did you treat the treasure in your hands with the reverence it deserved? I failed that test catastrophically, but I've spent the past 15 years learning to see clearly, to value authentically, to treat people with the respect they deserve, regardless of what they can do for me. I'll never fully make up for the damage I caused, but I can spend my remaining years ensuring that my mistakes become lessons for others. That's the best I can offer, a life lived in honest acknowledgement of failure, but determined pursuit of something better. The film ended with footage from the Lily Mitchell Initiative's 5th anniversary celebration, but the camera captured a moment Derek himself hadn't noticed at the time. Lily was surrounded by younger foster youth, but she was telling them her story with the kind of authentic vulnerability that only comes from genuine healing. In the background, Emma was watching with obvious maternal pride, but James had his arm around her shoulders, the two of them a picture of stable partnership. And off to the side, Derek was talking to a young man who'd just aged out of foster care, but the boy's body language showed the same defensive posture Derek remembered from his own lowest moments. Derek's hand was on the young man's shoulder, but his face showed patient compassion rather than judgment. The camera had captured the exact moment when the boy's expression shifted from skepticism to tentative hope, but it was the caption that made the scene devastating. Marcus aged out of foster care 3 years ago with nothing. Today, he's a program manager at the Richardson Foundation, overseeing services for youth in his former situation. He credits Derek Mitchell with seeing potential in him when he couldn't see it himself. He told me about his own failures, Marcus says, and somehow that made me believe my circumstances didn't have to be permanent. If someone who destroyed his own life could rebuild it into something meaningful, then maybe I could build something from nothing. As the credits rolled, the theater erupted in applause, but Derek felt Emma's hand squeeze his shoulder from the row behind him. "You've come so far," she whispered, but her voice carried genuine pride. "That man in the conference room 15 years ago would never have recognized who you've become." "That man couldn't have imagined any of this," Derek replied, but he gestured to the theater full of people whose lives had been touched by the ripple effects of his transformation. He was too busy climbing to realize the view from the bottom, once you've accepted it, is actually clearer. 20 years after the divorce. The Richardson estate in Connecticut was hosting a garden party, but the occasion was bittersweet. Emma had announced her retirement from active leadership of Richardson Global Industries, though she'd remain on the board. But the transition was being marked with celebration rather than corporate formality. Derek walked through the gardens where he'd never been invited during his marriage to Emma, but now he was a welcomed guest. At 62, he'd aged into a kind of distinguished silver, but his face carried the lines of someone who'd lived through both darkness and light. Lily, now 29 and running her own nonprofit, focused on foster care reform, was there with her fiancé, but she was introducing them to program graduates who'd become social workers, teachers, and advocates. The multiplication effect was visible everywhere Derek looked. People he'd mentored had mentored others, but each generation carried forward the message that transformation was possible. Emma found Derek near the rose garden, but she looked radiant at 56, her auburn hair now streaked with silver, but her green eyes still sharp and thoughtful. James was nearby, talking with a group of artists from Emma's scholarship program, but his presence in her life had been the steady partnership Emma deserved. 20 years, Emma said, but she stood beside Derek looking at the estate. "Can you believe it's been 20 years since you walked out with that suitcase?" "Some days it feels like yesterday," Derek admitted, but he meant it. "Other days it feels like a lifetime ago. I suppose it was a lifetime. My old life ended that day, but something better eventually grew from the ruins." "Do you still carry regret?" Emma asked, but the question was gentle rather than accusatory. "Every single day," Derek said honestly, but he looked at her with complete transparency. "Not just about losing you, though that's part of it. I regret who I was. The shallowness, the cruelty, the willful blindness. I regret the pain I caused you when you'd done nothing but love me. I regret that I needed such a devastating lesson to become a decent human being." He paused, but he watched Lily laughing with a group of younger people. "But I've learned to hold regret without letting it consume me," Derek continued, but his voice was thoughtful. "I can't change the past, but I can honor it by living differently now. Every person I help, every life that changes because of the programs we've built, every young person like Lily who believes in second chances, those are my penance and my purpose. I'll carry regret until I die, Emma, but I'll also carry gratitude that you didn't let me stay the person I was. Emma was quiet for a long moment, but then she did something unexpected. She took Derek's hand and held it between both of hers. I forgave you fully years ago, Emma said, but her voice was thick with emotion. But I want you to hear something I've never said directly. What you did to me was cruel and it hurt deeply, but it also freed me. I was hiding when I married you, hiding from my identity, from my responsibilities, from the full weight of who I was meant to become. Your betrayal shattered that hiding place, but it forced me to step into my full self. I became a better leader, a better philanthropist, a better person because I had to rebuild myself too. She squeezed his hand, but her eyes were gentle. We broke each other in different ways, Emma continued, but she smiled sadly. You broke my heart, but I broke your illusions. Both were necessary, though neither was pleasant. But what we've built, from those broken pieces, separately and occasionally together through our work, has helped so many people. Maybe that's the real lesson. Not that suffering is good, but that we can choose what we do with it. I don't deserve your forgiveness, Derek said, but Emma shook her head. Forgiveness isn't about deserving, she replied, but her voice was firm. It's about release. I forgave you so I could be free, not because you'd earned it. But Derek, I want you to know something else. I'm proud of who you've become. The man standing in this garden today is someone I'd be honored to know, even without our history. You've turned your worst failure into genuine service, but you've done it with humility and integrity. That's worthy of respect. Derek felt tears streaming down his face, but he didn't try to hide them. Emma's words meant more than any award, any recognition, any measure of success he'd ever received. Thank you, he whispered, but the words carried 20 years of accumulated gratitude for seeing who I could become when I couldn't see it myself, for using my story to help others, for letting me be part of the good work you're doing, for forgiving me even though I didn't deserve it. We all need grace, Emma said simply, but she released his hand and gestured toward the party. Come on. There are people who want to thank you, and Lily's about to give a speech about the program's 20th anniversary. You should be there for it. They walked back to the gathering together, but not as former spouses or even as old friends, as partners in a shared mission that had emerged from the ashes of their failed marriage. The party continued into the evening, but as the sun set over the Richardson estate, Derek stood with Emma, Lily, James, and dozens of people whose lives had been changed by the ripple effects of a devastating betrayal and a painstaking redemption. Lily's speech was powerful, but one line particularly struck Derek. My mom taught me that our worst experiences don't have to become our identity. They can become our fuel for transformation. Derek taught me that being broken isn't the same as being worthless. Together they showed me that love, real love, isn't about possession or control, but about seeing people clearly and supporting their growth even when it's messy. These programs exist because two people were brave enough to fail, to learn, and to use their pain as a source of purpose. That's the legacy I hope to carry forward. As the applause faded, Derek felt Emma lean close and whisper, "You did it, Derek. You took the worst thing you ever did and turned it into something beautiful. My grandfather would have been proud of you." And Derek understood, finally and completely, what it meant to measure wealth in things that couldn't be counted, in lives touched, in lessons learned, in the hard-won wisdom that comes from being crushed and devastated, but choosing to rise anyway. He'd been unaware his wife was the hidden heir to a billion-dollar empire, but he'd left her for his lover, unaware of her massive fortune and the revenge she planned. What she did had crushed him and left him devastated, but it had also freed him from the prison of his false values and shallow ambitions. The revenge had been complete, but the redemption had been real, and in the space between those two truths lay the story of two people who'd broken each other, but somehow, impossibly, had helped each other become better versions of themselves. Not together, not as they'd once hoped, but as partners in a larger mission that transcended their failed marriage and transformed it into something neither could have imagined. That night, as Derek drove home to his modest apartment, filled with meaningful rather than expensive things, he passed the Richardson Global Tower lit up against the Manhattan skyline. Once that building had represented everything he thought he wanted. Now it was simply a reminder of everything he'd learned, that the most valuable things in life can't be bought or climbed toward, but only earned through character, integrity, and the courage to face our failures with unflinching honesty. His phone buzzed with a text from Lily. "Thank you for being proof that people can change. Love you, Derek." He pulled over and cried, not from sadness, but from overwhelming gratitude. He'd lost everything 20 years ago, but he'd gained something infinitely more valuable, a life of genuine purpose, authentic relationships, and the peace that comes from finally understanding what actually matters. The man who'd walked out with a suitcase was gone forever, but the man who'd risen from his ashes was finally, imperfectly, completely himself. And that was worth more than any fortune, any title, any success he'd once thought he wanted. The revenge had crushed him, but the redemption had remade him, and in the end, both had been necessary.